examples. This is what I will do on the next test. I will be giving you examples of artwork, and I'll ask you to discuss them in some way, like I'm doing here in class today, and like I did last time. So, let me get the lights here adjusted better for you. So, we had stopped at this particular work, and I had asked, if you were asked to describe shape that you see here, what would you say? And I know that some people had said abstract. It's really non-objective because there isn't anything representational that we can see in this work. It just looks like paint, blobs of paint and threads of paint. You could, so that would be the sort of thing that I want you to say if you were talking about shape for this particular work. You could also certainly talk about line. There's actual line. You can see it in all these little sort of thread-like pieces of paint that are laying on the surface here. What kind of a function could you say that line serves here in this work? What does it do? What effect does it convey? We talked about line describing shape or forms, meaning representational sort of forms. Doesn't do that, does it? You could say that it creates movement. What tends to happen when you look at one of Jackson Pollock's works like this is your eyes tend to follow these lines. You sort of read them across the surface here of the painting, and so you could talk about it conveying movement. It also actually conveys expression, emotion. It shows the movement of the artist as he is pouring this paint, putting this paint on the composition. So you might say, something like that as well. Non-objective art is harder, because you don't have a story that you can see, so you don't have anything to start talking about, that leads you into other things. So if I show you a non-objective work of art, such as this, go through your minds, of what did she say about shape, what kind of shapes are there, what did she say about line, and we're going to be talking about color today, other things as well. And how does it function? What does it seem to be doing? What did she say about how shape functions or how line functions? You have to just ask yourself those sorts of questions. Okay. For this one, what would you say for shape? How could you describe shape here? Why? Right. Trees. So you could say they're organic. Anytime you have people, trees, things that have grown in nature, that means it's going to be organic. How else could you describe the shapes? Why? Right. So you could really say there's a combination of shapes here. There's organic shapes, there's geometric shapes. You could also say that they're representational because they look very much like what you would see in nature, and there's lots of detail given to you in this work. So you could talk about a shape in that way. What is the function of shape here? If it's representational, it's doing what? Yeah, it shows movement. Tells a story. That could be something else that you would say. As far as line, that's a little more difficult to say. If I asked you to talk about line, what kind of line would you say is there? Actual, implied, which kind? Do you see any actual line? Any outlines? Mostly not. The lines are implied, and I told you one way that implied lines are created is by juxtaposing, putting one color against another color, and where they meet, it sort of implies that there is a line there, an outline there, but it's not something the artist actually made. It's just when he butted up two different colors together, it gave you that impression. Line can also be read in a shape, and we really didn't talk about that. When you have shapes that seem rather thin, like the trunks here of the tree, you can almost read line in those trunks. And so, you could, if you explain to me that, yes, I see line, or I think line is present in the way that this thin trunk of a tree is moving off, curving off in different directions, I would give you credit for that. That's sort of implying another kind of line. The direction that the figures are walking, this man seems to be looking down at this dead body that's on a stretcher that he's carrying. That again is kind of an implied line. It sort of leads your eye down here to this figure that's covered up with the drapery. So again, you can talk about line in several ways in this work as well. This one, what kind of line is there? Actual. Now, where is it actual? Where do you see actual line? Yeah, the frame. How about the figure within? Where do you see outlines in the figure within? Yeah, there's actually black lines, that are outlining this figure. There's the line, outlining the halo. So you could talk about a lot of actual line in this particular work. If you were going to talk about shape, what could you say? Is it representational? Is it abstract? Is it non-objective? Pardon me? It is representational because it looks like, something recognizable, a human being. But it doesn't have all the details of representation. If you said representational and you really gave me a good reason why you say that, if you talk about it, and that's what I said, in that last test, give me a lot of information, give me the details that make you think what you think, that make you say that it's naturalism or, whatever. We could also say that this is abstract because the figure is really pretty simplified, The figure's head doesn't really show much of the skeletal features. We don't see, anything that really looks like wrinkles or the details of face. And again, if you look at the body, it doesn't look entirely like a human body. It does look like a human body, but it's simplified and even a little distorted maybe. And so that comes under that classification of abstract. So again, if you explained that to me when you said it was abstract, I would give you some credit, for doing that. So, this is the kind of thing that we'll do on the next test. And actually, I'm going to give you another written assignment next time and ask you to go and analyze a painting that is here on campus. And I'll be asking you to use these things that we're talking about here in order to analyze that painting. So I want to go on now. I don't understand why my cursor's not working. I'm going to go skip past this. And I'm going to go to another visual element that artists use. And in your book, it's referred to as light, and that's often the way that people refer to it, that are looking at a work of art and trying to talk about what they see in the work of art. Artists usually don't use that term. They prefer to use value. Value means the lightness or darkness of a color. And they think that is, the more proper term to use because that's what they are doing. They're actually choosing to use a lighter color versus a darker color to create the effect of light. And they feel like light is sort of confusing because when you say light, it usually makes people think of actual light. And so what we're really talking about for the most part in art is the illusion of light. You know, that something looks like it has light hitting it, or that there's a light source inside of the painting, but it's not actual light. And when we're talking about particularly a painting, we're not talking about some spotlight outside of the painting, you know, that's shining on it. We're really talking about the effects of light in that painting. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, some of these properties of color before we go to looking at some examples. The top scale that you're seeing here is a scale of values. It's the scale of gray, you know, moving towards white on one end and towards black on the other hand. Every color that can be used by an artist can have a value scale. And so what you see below are just two value scales, this one of red and this one of green. And the problem with scanning art and making slides of art as we used to do is it's really difficult to get the color exactly right. And so what you're seeing in this scale of red, the dark, you know, red down here looks black. But it's supposed to be a really dark maroon sort of color. The same thing with the green. That it's supposed to be a really dark green color, something that we might call in painting a hunter green, something like that. So, you know, the color is slightly distorted here that we're looking at because of the problems of scanning and photographing color. But every color, we could talk about purple having a value range from very light, you know, to very dark. We could talk about yellow, orange, any of the hues, any of the colors that are used in art can have this value range. So an artist, when he is making choices about, you know, what color he wants to use, he also has to make choices about the value range that he's going to use of that particular color. And so it gives him many more options. It gives him many more choices that he can use when he is creating a work of art, or when she is creating a work of art. Doesn't matter which it is. So to show you some examples of how light functions in works of art, if you're creating a naturalistic work of art, you know, if that's what your intent is, that's what the artist wants to do. He wants to give us a painting that looks so much like nature that we almost feel like we're looking out through a window and here's a scene taking place. Then he will want to use light to support that idea of naturalism. And he will use light to help to describe the forms. Here, for example, you know, if you look at the legs of this man right here, one side of the legs, and it's consistently the case, you know, are highlighted. The other sides are in shadow. And so what that implies is that this is a rounded form, and as that round form moves away from the light source, which is somewhere on the right here, the shadows get, you know, are picked up more and more until you have very dark shadows at one side. This artist is a man named Masaccio. He was an early Renaissance artist, and he's really the first artist to consistently use light coming from one direction. In the Middle Ages, often the directions that light would hit objects within a painting would differ. You know, some might be from the right, some from the left, some from the top, some from the bottom. They were never consistent. And so as a result, the works didn't really look entirely naturalistic. You know, they looked like they were just artificial, like they were painted kinds of images that some artist had created. So he understood that, you know, if you use a consistent light coming from one side of the composition, and that's called a side light, that you can heighten this sense of naturalism that he was trying to achieve in the art. This use of highlights on one side and shadows on the other is called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is an Italian term. A lot of the terms in art are Italian because the Renaissance artists, for a long time were sort of seen as the peak of art, the best that art could be. And so these terms were defined based upon their work. And now they're used for everything else as well. So chiaroscuro means using, chiaro, it means light, scuro means dark. So it means using these light values and dark values in order to create a three-dimensional looking form. Another term that's used for the actual technique of using these highlights and shadows is called modeling. And, these are terms that I might ask you to identify on a test. So one thing that light does is to describe objects, shapes, spaces, to make them look naturalistic. Then another thing that light has been used by artists to do is to create emotion, to create a mood or an expression within a work of art. And that kind of light is called tenebrism. I spelled that for you right here. It means using light and dark to create an emotional expression. Usually it means exaggerating the lights and the darks in order to create that expression. And here you see it used in a painting. And I brought in this example from a book on light to just, point out that different directions of light create different kinds of feelings. If you look at this one, she looks a little sinister or, a little maybe dangerous, the way that you have these dark shadows, right at the top of her cheekbones and that sort of circle her eyes. Here, where her face is fully highlighted, she just looks like some person we might like to get to know. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with her. Again, this one, this is a light coming from the top so that her brows shadow her eyes. And so this makes her, sometimes look very mysterious or, again, rather dangerous sometimes because we can't read her eyes. We can't see what, is really going on there. So artists, figured out very quickly, that light can be used in that way. And so this artist, Caravaggio, he was an Italian artist during the Baroque period, which is the 1600s, the late 1500s into the 1600s. He actually developed this this really sharp contrast of highlights and shadows and developed what we call tenebrism today. And this shows the conversion of St. Paul. In the Bible, St. Paul was persecuting Christians. He may have been involved in the condemning of St. Stephen. St. Stephen was the first martyr that occurs in the Bible, and St. Paul may have been involved in it. And he was on his way to Damascus to find more Christians to persecute, and he had a revelation. A miracle occurred. He heard God's voice asking him, why are you persecuting these people? And so this is the scene that Caravaggio is trying to show, that St. Paul, he's down here, he's sort of thrown up his arms because he hears this voice coming out of the darkness in the middle of the night. And so Caravaggio, thought, this would be a really shocking event. This would really surprise and maybe scare someone, if they heard this voice coming out of the darkness. And so he wants to try and show that kind of emotion. And he decided that one way he could do that, he could do it by face if he wanted to, or gestures if he wanted to. But he thought, if I use a light that is really sharp and then disappears into great darkness. For example, look here. We see the forearm of this leg of the horse. We see the edge of the back leg of the horse, but then all of this in here is sort of dark. We can't really see much of the horse's body. We can't really tell, what is happening in those areas. And he decided, if I give them, really sharp contrast, some parts that look clear, and then I suddenly plunge them into a really dark space, it'll make people get a sense of the emotion that this man must have felt, the kind of feelings or drama that he felt. And so Caravaggio develops this kind of art. He influences generations of artists after him who use this sharp contrast of light and shadow in order to set a mood or to create a kind of expression within their art. Then another way or function that art serves is a compositional function, to draw our eye to one particular place, to say, here's the focal point, or here's where I want you to go. And here we've looked at this work before when we talked about abstract versus organic kinds of shapes. Here we see, a highlighted area, white, and the white music or paper, whatever this is, right here. And it draws our attention because it's the brightest area within the composition, and there isn't as much of it. There's more of these dark areas, and these yellow sort of areas are called a middle value area. So you have very little that's really bright at the far end of that value scale. And so artists realized that they could draw attention in that way. If they would have a little bit of some value against a lot of other values within a composition. So this is used here primarily for a compositional reason, to create a focal point. Sometimes it can also be used in just a very decorative way. If you have a pattern of lights and darks, lights and darks, lights and darks, maybe to describe a blanket or the fabric that somebody is wearing, that's how they would use it, to create a decorative sort of effect. This is a man that was Spanish, a friend of Pablo Picasso, and he followed Pablo Picasso in creating Cubism, and that's what this style is called. In sculpture, light can also be used to create different kinds of effects. We tend to think, sculpture in the first place they don't create the effects of light within the sculpture. It does have to use actual light from outside. But the way the artist creates the object will make the light that's coming from outside look different in different works of art. So here, for example, you have a work of art. This, again, is a Cubist work of art in which the artist has carved these forms in very flat, sort of geometric shapes. They have broad planes that are flat. If we could touch it, it'd be very flat and smooth. It wouldn't feel rounded at all. And he partially understood that if he creates something like this, and if light hits it, then it's going to tend to going to tend to create very sharp contrast. The highlight hits this flat plane here, but where it turns at an angle away from us, it's going to be a deep, dark shadow. This kind of light, where it seems to be coming from the front, we call frontal light. And it usually emphasizes the flatness of a form. It really doesn't emphasize the roundness of a form. And since this artist created the form in a series of flat planes, it just, reinforces, the light reinforces what he's done in the way he's treated the shapes. If you create a rounded form in sculpture, then the same thing that happens in painting, where the light changes gradually from a highlighted area to a shadowed area, particularly if you're using a side light. And that's the way that this has been highlighted here. We have a side light coming a little bit above and from the left. And so the brightest part of the light that we see is on this area, also on this area. But then as it rounds off, the middle values right here begin to pick up until finally we come to a really dark area. So a side light, and lighting a rounded form will emphasize that roundness. It further supports, what the artist has actually carved, the kind of shapes that he's carved. Okay. I'm going to just go on since we can review later, and I want to go ahead and start talking about another visual element, and that visual element is color. There are some terms that I need to define for you. The term hue just simply means the name of a color. So, looking at this color wheel, we might talk about the blue color. An artist would usually talk about the blue hue. They tend to use the word hue instead of using color. So that's all that means. It's not some really fancy or sophisticated concept that's being used here. Now this is a color wheel, and it's sort of a typical color wheel. Color wheels began to develop at the beginning of the 19th century when people were studying light. And they realized that light could be broken down into individual hues with a prism. Using a prism, you could break down light into, like a rainbow, similar to a rainbow. And so people began to develop color wheels based upon what they saw, the relationships of one color to another. If you ever look at a rainbow, you will notice that the blue, anything that looks blue or purple, that they're next to each other in the rainbow. And then anything that looks yellow or orange is next to it, each other on the rainbow. So people began to develop different kinds of color wheels. Some of them have hundreds of different divisions. But this has sort of become the standard color wheel that's used today. The areas that are marked with 1 are what are called primary colors. And the primary colors are blue, yellow, and red. So blue, and they're equal distance to each other. See, there's 3 hues in between them on this color wheel. A primary color is a color that cannot be created by mixing any other colors together. That's why they're called primary. They're pure colors. The secondary colors that are marked 2 on this wheel can be created by mixing 2 primary colors together. So, here is orange. If you mix yellow, a primary color, with red, a primary color, you can achieve orange. Or yellow with blue will give you green, and this green is off. Again, the color is off on this. It's just impossible to scan it and get it correctly. Or if you mix blue with red, you get a violet. So those are what are called secondary colors. You mix 2 primaries together to get the secondary. And then finally, on this particular wheel, there is a third set of colors, and they're called tertiary colors. And they are made by mixing 1 primary with 1 secondary. And so this color, for example, is called red-violet. And in other words, it tells you exactly what 2 colors were put together in order to achieve this color. The primary color being the red and, the violet being the secondary. Or up here, yellow primary color mixed with a secondary color of green gives you a yellow-green. So, artists learn the relationship of these colors to each other on a color wheel because there are different kind of effects that you can create by choosing to use, different combinations of color. And I'll show you some examples of them in a minute. Another thing that color has, we've already mentioned, is value. That every color can have a range from very light to very dark. The lights are called tints, and the darks are called shades. And so if you kind of remember that shade and shadow go together, and shadows are dark, that is one way of trying to remember, how this value range is created. So, as I already mentioned, not only can an artist choose a particular hue, they can also choose one of the values of that hue. And then finally, they can also choose one of the intensities of that particular value. And so here I've used, just a value up here at the top. And if we had red at this high dark value, then we could get different intensities of that value. Or I could have moved down here to this one, and I could have given you different intensities of a low light of red. What intensity means, and there's two other words that mean the same thing that are used interchangeably, saturation, chroma, they all mean the same thing. What they mean is they mean the purity or the brightness of a color. And if you want to think of it as opposites, then think the brightness or dullness of a color. So for a high dark of red, if the red, high dark of red is at full intensity, it would look like this. And to give you something that you can relate in your everyday life, think of a stop sign. A stop sign is a very bright, intense red. That same red, exactly the same red, but at a fourth intensity, would give you a color like a brick. Very dull sort of color. It's still red. It could be exactly the same value of red as the stoplight or the stop sign. And what makes it different is the intensity of that color. Usually when artists create these duller areas, they add black to whatever hue they're using and whatever value of that hue they're using until they get the intensity that they want. So think of all three of these as meaning the brightness or the dullness of a particular hue. Now, as I said, artists are taught this in design classes. That's one of the basic things that they're first taught, is to remember the relationships of colors on that color wheel, because you can get different kinds of effects based upon which ones you choose and how they relate to other hues. And we often call these choices or these color schemes that artists use, we often call them harmonies, meaning that the colors seem to go together. And there are lots of different kinds of harmonies, and I'm just going to show you four of the basic ones. They're the same ones that I think are in your book. I'm pretty sure, if I remember right, your book talks about them also. This is what we would call a monochromatic harmony. And what that means is that this, and it doesn't show in this slide again, it looks like we have browns and yellows, but the yellows are just supposed to be a more saturated brown. And in scanning this, it came out yellow, and no matter how many times I scanned it and tried to get it to come out looking brown, I couldn't get it to look out brown. So think of these yellow areas as being brown, not yellow. So a monochromatic harmony means that the artist takes one hue, and in this instance, Picasso took brown, and then he simply used a range of values of brown and a range of intensities of brown. So some areas were brighter, and those were the ones that came out looking yellow here in this work, and then in some of the other areas, they're duller. So that's the difference in intensity or saturation. And we also have, darker areas here, darker values versus lighter values. A lot of people decorate their homes in this way. If they're a little concerned or they don't feel like they understand color and they don't want to get color that looks like it's clashing with each other, then sometimes people just say, I like blue, so I'm going to make everything blue in my room. And so the walls are one shade of blue or one value of blue, and the couch is another, and the carpet is another. So whenever an artist uses one hue and then just varies it, by value or saturation, we're talking about a monochromatic sort of harmony, and it seems to go together because it's all brown, just different kinds of brown. Then another kind of harmony that artists often use is what's called complementary harmony. And on the right, you see an artist. He was an American artist, Stuart Davis, who used that kind of a complementary harmony. A complementary hue is a hue that is opposite its complement on the other side of the wheel. So we talk about red as being the complement of green, or we talk about green being the complement of red. Blue becomes the complement of orange. And they do seem to go together well. They don't look like they clash. They look like they're harmonious. And so artists often will create works of art in which they play with these complementaries. And he has two sets of complementaries here. He has the blue and the orange, as on the color wheel. And then he has white and black. White and black are considered to be complements to each other. They're not really on the color wheel, and we don't really call them, artists don't call them hues. They're called neutrals instead of hues in art. But they are opposite each other. They seem to be the opposite kind of thing. So we could talk about the black and white being a complementary here. The red just seems to be in the background and, just fills the whole background, and it really doesn't have a complement here. It's mainly what we're looking at here in the foreground that sets up this complementary sort of harmony. The reason sometimes that artists will choose to use this kind of an arrangement of color is that it seems more alive. You have more variety. Your eye can sort of jump, from one area to another. And so artists choose this if they want their work of art to just look more alive, to look like there's more movement in it and there's more emotion in it. They will choose this kind of a harmony. You choose a monochromatic harmony, if you want everything to look very stable and sort of peaceful and, no big differences, in what you're creating. Then another kind of harmony is called analogous harmony, and Claude Monet used that in this painting. And analogous harmony is an artist choosing to use mostly colors on the same side of the color wheel. So as you can see here, he used some blues, he used lots of greens, he used some purples up here in the building. He does have a few contrasts. He has a little orange, so that makes a complement to the blue. He has a little bit of yellow, but mostly, the majority of the color in this are colors or hues that are found on the same side of the color wheel. And again, this is a kind of harmony that people will use if they want something to look rather peaceful or calm or pleasant, serene, all those kinds of adjectives might be used to describe a painting that's using this kind of harmony. He doesn't want a lot of movement. He doesn't want us jumping around a lot in the composition. And then finally, one other basic harmony is this harmony. It's called triadic. And what happens in this kind of a harmony is the artist uses three colors. The color scheme is dominated mainly by three colors, and those three colors are equal distance from each other on the color wheel. In this one, Picasso used blue, he used yellow, and he used red. This looks orange right here, but it's really more red than orange. So he used the primary colors as his main color scheme, and then he added a few complementaries, particularly the orange, that complements the blue. And again, this is a type of harmony that looks more alive, that gives you more of a sense of movement. And so that's why an artist would choose to use that. So, artists know that certain relationships of color cause people to feel in certain ways. People tend to react to, monochromatic harmonies as everything just seems very serene, very pleasant, quiet, nothing really, exciting is happening. Then, sometimes artists create color discord. In other words, they will choose to use colors that seem to clash with each other. And this artist did that, although I have a problem with color discord, because nowadays we accept most everything. And so as a result, to us, it doesn't look like it's clashing very much. We have so many combinations. I can remember when I was a little girl, if I had chosen to wear purple with orange, my mother would have had a fit. She would have said, those don't go together. You can't wear those. I'm not going to let you wear those. Well, nowadays, you sometimes see, clothing with orange and purple, and nobody cares a bit, that you're wearing that. So I just think it's harder for an artist to create something that looks clashing or somehow discordant. The idea that an artist sometimes has when they want to use these colors is they want you to feel bad, or they want you to understand some really strong emotion that they're expressing in the work. This artist, for example, is supposed to use color discord, but I really don't think it works that well, and I think that his subject matter, of this silly-looking cow that looks like she's sort of frolicking. Well, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of those cows we see on TV now, that they're all wanting to go to California because California cows are better. I don't remember what the commercial's about. That's what it sort of reminds me of. She doesn't look unhappy, or it doesn't look like he wants us to think, oh, this is an awful cow. She looks silly. So I don't really know that it works all that well, but this is given as an example in some books of color discord, and he did like to create color discord, but I don't know that it works all that well. There are other kinds of effects also that artists have to be aware of and that they learn about in a basic design class. They learn a lot about the kind of optical effects. They're almost like illusions that occur in art, because an artist can use those in order to create different kinds of expression within the work. And one thing they're taught very quickly is that color changes based upon the surrounding colors that are in it. And here you see, this is, a diagram to show that effect. This is not really a work of art. In all of these squares, the purple, let me get that off. Come on. I don't know, it's not going off. In this, the purple square right here is exactly the same. It is exactly the same hue, the same value, the same saturation. There is nothing different, and yet they look different. This one, for example, the purple with the orange background looks lighter than this one up here, for example, that looks darker against the green background, or the purple against this lighter blue background. So, artists learn that, I can create an effect perhaps better by putting two colors against each other and letting these optical effects occur than if I just tried to choose the right color, just the exact right color to convey something. So they will often do that. And then another kind of effect that happens is called simultaneous contrast. And what this effect occurs when an artist chooses two complementary colors. Green and red are complements. And what happens when you put complementary colors together, it tends to make both of them look brighter. And so what this diagram is supposed to show you, and I don't think it really does a very good job of doing that, is this green ought to look greener than this big square of green down here below. And the reason it should look greener is because of the red that's around it. And as I said, I don't really think that it works very well because of the problems in scanning and photographing things. But again, artists realizing that this can happen, and maybe they just feel that they can't get quite that brightness of the green that they want, so they will use a red beside it. This is also something that you encounter, I would say probably once a week maybe. Butchers often will put green parsley or green paper or something around their red meat because they know it'll make the meat look fresher. It'll make the meat look redder if they have green next to it. So it works, in everyday life just as it works in color. Now, there are different artists refer to color in different ways, and color has different kinds of functions. Artists often refer to local color, and what local color is, it's the color you expect to see an object in. So, for example, I brought in this painting by Raphael. Raphael knows that we think of sky as blue. And that was the case then, just as it is now. And so he painted the sky blue. He knows that we expect dirt to look brown. We expect grass to look green. We expect leaves to look green. So in other words, artists will use local color when they want to give us the kind of effects that we expect things to be in. Usually those are naturalistic effects. When they're painting something, they know that we expect the sky to be blue, so they paint it blue, to meet what our expectations are. So, that is what is happening here, and it is, an effect that's primarily used, or a kind of color it's primarily used when you want naturalistic sort of effects within a work of art. Here's just an example of an artist using it in sculpture. These two little figures are from, and actually this is not so little, this is about 3 foot high, the camel that you're seeing here. These were made by the Chinese in the Tang Dynasty. And many of the objects that they created, they painted, again, with local color. They knew that people would look, in China at that time, would look at this camel and say, a camel is this color. And so that's what the artist painted it, because he wanted us to think of it as something very naturalistic, something that looks exactly like a camel looks. Then another kind of color is called optical color. And this is color that an artist will create to show us a particular effect of light. For example, in this work, the artist is telling us that this woman is sitting at this table, and there's a candle behind that skull that she's touching. We see the flame of the candle right here. And he decided, I want to paint everything within this painting exactly as it would look under candlelight, the particular effect of a candle. And so, she probably has a white blouse on, and the reason I say that is because the blouse looks yellow. It looks like the exact same yellow as the yellow of the flame. If it had been a brown blouse or a green blouse, then this yellow would have looked different. It wouldn't have resembled the flame exactly, but it would have looked like it had some light coming, from that candle. But since the yellow looks exactly like the yellow of the candle, probably she's wearing a white blouse. But when the candle lights her up, when there's no other light in the room except for that candle, then that colors her blouse yellow, where the high light, is hitting from the candle. But where it's in shadow, it looks orange. So this is an artist who really thought about carefully, how does candlelight look? How does candlelight affect the color that's seen under that condition? It's often used to create emotion or a mood. Here, she's sort of staring off into the distance as if she's sort of thinking, very pensive. This is supposed to represent Mary Magdalene. And, she's probably represented after the death of Jesus, and she's thinking about, how powerful he was, how much, she loved him and followed him, and why was he killed. She's probably thinking something like that. So it's often used to create some sort of mood or to create some sort of expression. But it can also be used to create a naturalistic effect. Here we have an outdoor scene once again using optical color. In other words, meaning that Monet, when he painted this, was really looking at the kind of color he saw in nature as it was revealed by the sunlight, that was fully lighting this area. It's different from local color because in local color, if someone said, well, I know that people expect this tree to look green, to have green leaves. Then in local color, all the leaves in this tree would be green. There wouldn't be variation. But Monet, because he's actually looking at the color he sees under a bright sunlight, he says, that tree isn't all green. It has some yellows, it has some browns, it has some oranges maybe. And so he's painting exactly what we see under a sunlit condition. And so it's different from what we expect to see, what we think the tree looks like. This kind of effect that you see here is called optical mixture as well, because he's taking little flecks of paint and using them to define these forms and giving us all that variety. And he knows that our brains are going to sort of simplify that a little bit and sort of, pull it all together, sort of unify it together. But at the same time, he wants to be very faithful, to what he actually sees. So he wants to give us all of that variation. So this is just another kind of optical color that we're seeing here. Then another optical effect is called receding and advancing color. Some colors seem to come forward to us, mainly the colors that we call warmer hues. I put that at the bottom here of the screen. When we refer to warm hues, we mean the yellows, the oranges, the reds. Those are what are called warm hues. The reason that they're called warm, again, is something that perceptual psychologists deal with. They think that we relate those colors to things that are warm in our world, like, flames are yellow sometimes. An electric stove, when the coils heat up, they become red or orange, in color. And so that is why we tend to feel like we're looking at something warm when we look at orange or yellow, one of those warm hues. The cool hues are the blue, greens, purples. And again, perceptual psychologists say, we tend to associate those hues with things that are cold. Water cools us, in the summertime. Icicles sometimes have, a slight bluish sort of quality. So in other words, we associate cool things with those hues, blue, green, and purple. So, and the cool hues tend to look like they're receding away from us. They just look like they're farther away. They don't pop out as strongly as the warm hues do. So as a result of that, artists can use that to create an illusion of depth. They can make us believe that we're looking at distance, moving away from us. And so here in this particular work, the darker browns and the yellows, that you see here in the rock right here, they're in the foreground. And then as we go into the background, and supposedly as we're going farther and farther away into distance, the artist begins to paint purples and blues and sort of grays to just heighten that sense that we're looking at something very far away from us, versus something that's really close. So again, that's another optical effect that artists can use. And if they want to create a naturalistic work like this, then that's what they're going to use, because they want us to believe that we're seeing depth or we're seeing distance far away. Then another kind of color is called arbitrary or subjective color. So we have local color, we have optical color, and we have subjective color or arbitrary color. And what that means, it just means that the artist makes the choice of colors. It doesn't have to be based upon what he knows we think nature looks like. It can be just his choice. And so, for example, here, this is a wife of this artist. This is Madame Matisse, and the artist's name is Henri Matisse. And he's painted her with a green stripe down the middle of her nose. Well, nobody has that. He knows that. In other words, he's telling us, I'm not really creating naturalism. I don't really care that much, what she actually looks like. I'm using color to do something else. And part of why he used color was for expression. He was trying to create an emotion in his art. And so he made choices of his color because of that, not because they looked natural. And also he used this green stripe particularly in order to create the focal point, to make us really look here in the center at her face. And we know that he added this later because we have sketches that he made of this work. He had painted, this face, possibly, all in this hue that you see here on the right, which looks a little bit like flesh, color. And he had these more intense colors in the background. And when he first painted her, he realized that, she's the main subject of the work, but she looks like she's sort of being absorbed into the background. She's sort of sinking back in the background, so she didn't look as dominant in the composition. And so in the sketchbook, he started experimenting with how can I pull her face forward. He didn't want to give up the color he'd used in the background. He thought that was very expressive. So he didn't want to give that up. So, his decision was, how can I do something to her face so her face really pops forward and really makes it look like it's the focal point. And so he did a number of experiments and eventually decided, if I contrast one side of her face to the other, making one side look rather fleshy, making this side yellow, that's certainly going to call attention to her face. And then the whole thing, he felt, just sort of came together when he put this green down the middle of her nose. Because everybody, looks at this and says, why did he do that? People don't have green stripes down the middle of their nose. So it does immediately call attention to her, and you almost forget about the other colors that are in the background. So he made, arbitrary choices. He made choices in order to create what he thought would be a good composition and would still be an expressive composition, and created this. If somebody had said to him, and in fact somebody did one time say to him something about another painting, not this one, and they said, that's not what a woman looks like. And he said to this person, I'm not painting a woman, I'm painting a painting. And so, in other words, he made a distinction between, the reality of just making a representational image and an artist exploring his feelings and exploring art and trying to create a good composition. Of course, another thing that color does is create emotion, and probably that's the one thing that most people think about at the beginning when they think about color. They really think more about color creating emotion or expression than anything else. Didn't mean to hit that. We've talked about this before, and at that time, I said that Vincent van Gogh wrote his brother, and he described the colors he used in this. And he said, I'm using these colors because it will convey the idea that people can lose their lives in night cafes like this. They might murder someone. So Vincent chose his colors for the expression, not, because this is exactly what the place looked like, or it wasn't primarily for naturalism. And so, he chose to use this almost blood-like red here on the background. He chose the complement because he knew by using green in the billiard table and in this bar that you see back here and also in the tabletops, that would really make both of them brighter, because they are complementaries. He chose a very bright yellow. He knew that yellow was going to clash slightly with, the green of the billiard table. Every choice he made in terms of color were chosen for the expression he wanted to create. And that is often the thing that most people think about. That is the way we generally respond, to color. Everybody has their likes, certain colors they like, and people have colors that they don't like. And so we do really respond in an expressive sort of way. Color, however, has also been used for symbolism. And that was particularly the case in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Mary is always depicted with a rose gown and a blue mantle. And those became her colors. So if you, in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, if you saw a statue with these colors, and particularly if she were carrying a baby, then you knew that was Mary. You didn't have to be told. You just knew that those are the colors that are used to symbolize her. And so, color has been used for symbolic sort of purpose as well as expression or as well as naturalism. And then it's also been used to create clarity in a composition, and that's often the way architects use color. Here in the inside of this building, the architect, has contrasted the white walls, or sort of cream-colored walls that we see here, with it's a type of stone. It's sort of a gray-green color stone that they have in Italy. And he's used that color to define all of the attachments to the walls, all the moldings. And so it creates sort of an order, sort of a division to the building. And that's very clearly seen because of this contrast of color that he's used. So color can be used in that way as well. Okay. Again, I'm going to just go by that and start talking about texture. Texture is another visual element. And when we talk about texture, we mean the surface quality of things. But again, it doesn't have to always be actual texture. Here we see a shell, and we could run our hands on it, and we would feel that it was very rough. And so this is a case of actual texture. And artists do use actual texture within artwork. We've already talked about impasto before, that Vincent van Gogh used thick paint. If we could run our hands across his work, we would feel that it's really bumpy because he used thick paint, and he let that thick paint, project out from the surface of the canvas. So that's a case where we would say he uses actual texture within his work. Another way of creating actual texture is seen here. Artists have mixed paint with concrete, with plaster, with sand. This artist used pigment, the color, and he mixed it with plaster and applied it to a surface. Then he gouged out areas of it so that we're really aware that there's a thickness to, this surface that we're looking at. So that's another way of creating actual texture. And then this artist would wander around in the streets picking up things. Here's a wheel off of a baby buggy probably that he picked up. It's an actual metal wheel that he glued to the surface of this painting. This is the spokes, probably from a larger wheel that he added. Some artists, add pieces of paper, pieces of cloth, and other things and they paste it onto a surface, and then they'll often paint on top of them. And whenever they do something like this, it's called a collage, which a collage actually means pasting something to a surface. It's a French word. And so again, by pasting, bits and pieces of actual objects to the surface, again, you're adding actual texture. If you could touch it, you'd feel the various textures that he's created here. But artists can, and I forgot to mention, I was going to just show you these. Architects do the same thing, and sculptors do the same thing. On the right there, you're looking at a bronze head that a Swiss artist named Giacometti created. And he could have made the head look very smooth. He could have sanded away all those ridges and all those pits that you see here. But he wanted that actual texture. He thought it was expressive. And so he wanted all that actual texture there. Architects often use texture, to contrast different parts of the buildings. As you see here, the bottom of this building has very rough hewn stones. They haven't been smoothed down. And that's because he thought the bottom of the building is where the most ordinary sorts of activities took place. But then on the upper floors, where the family lived, and this is the Medici's home for a while, he makes all the stones there very flat, very smooth. And the reason was he thought this is where educated people live. So I want the upper parts to look very refined. So again, architects will often use texture as well to define parts of the composition or to give a particular kind of expression to something. But artists can also create what's called implied texture, or it's also called visual texture. And when we use this, we mean the texture's not really there, but they give you the illusion that it's there. So in this painting, for example, that we've looked at before, the dog looks very wiry. I don't remember if I brought in, no I didn't, whoops, wrong way. Yeah, I brought in some details. The dog looks very wiry. There's a dull sort of sheen on this part of the chandelier, and then a much brighter sheen right here. This is all created by the artist. Artists learn that different textures have different patterns of light and dark. And they use light and dark, they use line, they use all these visual elements we've talked about in order to create this implied kind of texture within a work of art. Okay, I think, just another example. Sculptors do this too. This is a sculpture made out of marble. It's over life size. It shows Pluto here, the god of the underworld. And he is kidnapping Persephone. She's an earthly girl that he fell in love with, and so he took her to the underworld with him. And it's all made out of marble. It's not made out of real flesh. It's not made out of any other materials. And yet this sculptor knew how to carve so that he could capture highlights and shadows so well that he makes this hand. We're looking at this hand right here. And it really looks like that hand is pressing into her thigh. It makes the thigh look really soft, like he's pressing in. And he was also able to even give you different layers of the hand. We're seeing tendons and blood vessels underneath skin here in the hand. And he does it entirely by knowing how to carve to get the right kind of effects of light and shadow within this work, to give it that sort of effect. So again, we would talk about this being implied texture because it's not really there. If we touched it, we'd see that it's just all marble, it's just all stone in effect. But it visually gives us that feeling of texture. Okay, we'll finish up just a few more things on texture, and we'll finish up on the visual elements next time.